This is lesson 6.6 about function operations. In this first video, you will learn how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide functions, and you will also learn how to determine the domain of a function. So if we're going to add two functions, such as these two functions, one way that you can be instructed to do that is if it says f plus g of x. The other way is if it says f of x plus g of x. To do this, you simply add like terms. So f plus g is going to be 6x minus 4. If you're going to subtract, you can see there's two different ways to say that you want to subtract. And then to subtract them, you simply subtract like terms. Of course, I like to distribute the negative. So f minus g gives us negative 2x plus 10. To determine the domain of a function or the domain of two functions combined, you have to consider the domain of each function originally. So since our first function here is a linear function, you know the domain to any linear function is all real numbers. This next function, also linear, so it's all real numbers. And when we calculated the answer was a linear function, so the domain here is all real numbers. So that one wasn't particularly interesting. Subtraction, the same thing. It's just going to be all real numbers. This one will be more interesting. If we do f plus g of x, we're simply adding like terms here. So the 4x plus 1x is going to give us 5x. And then we have a square root of x and a constant term. So there's f plus g. Now to determine the domain, we have first a linear function for f of x. So the domain here is all real numbers. But for the g function, we have a square root. The domain to a square root is not going to be all real numbers. It will be limited because we cannot take the square root of a negative number. So because of that, x has to be greater than or equal to 0. Otherwise, we would not be able to take the square root. So the domain to our function f plus g is going to be equal to the most limited domain, which is the domain for g. So domain here will be all real numbers, where x has to be greater than or equal to 0 because of the square root. So to multiply functions, you're just FOILing. So 2x plus 4x is 8x squared. For outside, we get negative 14x. For inside, we get 12x. And last, we get negative 21. Combining like terms, we get 8x squared minus 2x minus 21. So this is f times g. For division, you really just set it up as f over g. If your fraction reduces, then you are required to reduce it. In this case, we are not able to reduce that. Next, we have to determine the domain. For our multiplication problem here, we started out with a linear times a linear, so those domains are all real numbers. And we ended up with a quadratic. The domain to a quadratic is also all real numbers. So the domain here is all real numbers. But for the division problem, you cannot divide by 0. So this domain is going to be limited. We start out with all real numbers because they're both linear, but whatever makes this denominator equal 0 is something we would not be able to calculate. Therefore, it's not included in the domain. So the domain is going to be everything except 7/4. So domain is all real numbers, except x cannot equal 7/4. Because when x equals 7/4, we would be dividing by 0, and that is not possible.